Hello, everyone. My name is Skye McDonald, and I'm a professor at the School of Psychology at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, in Australia. And Ellie is a great friend of mine. Ellie and I actually published a study together. This was a cross-world study, and it really was his idea. Ellie arrived in my office in Sydney. I don't actually even remember what year that was, Ellie, but a while ago now. But anyway, we sat together and we batted around ideas about what we could do in common and went away with this research plan, which Ellie really took the leadership on and ultimately resulted in the publication. And what we were interested in at that time was the effect of emotion and emotional expression on people's recognition for faces. So that was a really fantastic collaboration. Now, I appreciate that a lot of Ellie's work and a lot of the work that we'll be discussing today at this celebration of Ellie will be to do with memory. But my own work is, in general, less to do with memory and more to do with emotion. So I thought you might be a little bit interested to find out some of the work that I've been doing in emotion, which of course relates to the work that Ellie and I did together. So that's what I'm going to just talk about now. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So what I'd like to talk about in particular is the extent to which simulation might influence our ability to understand emotions in others. Now, the reason that I've been interested in this in particular is because I do a lot of work with people with severe traumatic brain injury, as does Ellie. And my interest has been specifically to try to understand what it is about some people with severe traumatic brain injury that makes it very difficult for them to understand what another person might be experiencing in terms of their own emotions. Okay, so we know that people with traumatic brain injury tend to score quite poorly on tests of emotion perception when they're asked to sort of basically identify the emotion they think someone else might be experiencing. And this has been demonstrated again and again and again. And my interest has been in trying to think about, well, why? What kind of mechanisms might go into that and influence that? So I've particularly become interested in this role of simulation, and that is the extent to which we actually model someone else's emotional experience in ourselves, and that provides us with cues in order to understand how they're feeling. So just to show you, just for a start, how people tend to do on emotion recognition tasks. This is an emotion recognition task that was constructed. Actually, it was constructed with stimuli that was created by Roy Kessels in the Netherlands, who is another colleague, and we used these stimuli, which was sort of the stimuli going from a neutral expression through to a full-blown emotional expression in a short video. They were sort of morphed images, looking at the 7 basic emotions of happiness, surprise, anger, sadness, disgust, neutral, fear. I think that's it. And so this was one study that we've done. We've done lots, but this one was conducted by Hannah Rosenberg, who I had photoed in the previous slide. And if we just look at emotion performance across the different expressions, we find that people who have a traumatic brain injury, so that's the orange line here, tend to perform more poorly than the controls. Now, I just point out in this particular study was controlled for the level of inherent difficulty of the different emotions, because we find that some emotions, for example, fear, tend to be very poorly recognized by everyone. So they're really quite difficult, whereas others like happiness, everyone gets right. So in this particular study, we tried to control the level of difficulty by using stimuli that were at different levels of intensity. So we can see that anger was at a 20% level of intensity, disgust 30% level, whereas fear was at 100% level of intensity, and so on. And each level of intensity was chosen to get roughly 50% accuracy in our control group across the different types of emotion. And we can see that when we do that, we generally have impaired performance in our people with traumatic brain injury, regardless of the emotional valence. So the question that we were interested, one of the questions that we've been interested to address is, why do people with traumatic brain injury have these difficulties? Is it because they are not emulating those experiences in themselves, so they're not simulating another person's experience? Okay, so there's many theories about simulation, that we somehow look at another person's emotion, it causes us to have a similar experience in ourselves, and that gives us information to understand the other person. So in order to look at this notion of simulation, we did a number of other kinds of studies. So in these studies, we basically used emotional stimuli like these, where we've got very unpleasant, emotionally unpleasant images, neutral images, and emotionally pleasant images, particularly if you're a heterosexual male, which all our brain injured and controls were in this particular study. And we looked at the extent to which people showed physiological arousal to these images. Now, you would expect normally people will show arousal to both negative and positive images relative to neutral. And that is in fact what we found. So looking at these pictures, we measure this with skin conductance, and we can see here that our control group showed higher arousal to pleasant and unpleasant images compared to neutral, which is what we would expect. But if we look at our brain injured, we find that they're actually really flat across the board. They're not really showing any differential arousal. Now, we also did this with movies, and I should say also this is Jackie Rushby, who was the postdoc in my lab at the time doing the skin conductance work. And again, watching movies, we get exactly the same pattern. The controls are showing arousal to pleasant versus unpleasant, but not neutral, whereas the people with brain injury are fairly subdued in their responses, and they're particularly subdued to unpleasant, and that's significant. So the question is this sort of lack of simulation, this lack of response, in any way related to the ability to recognise emotions? So what we did was a couple of studies that looked at that, and in particular, we had a couple of other tasks that were about expressing and feeling emotions. So in these, we had we asked people with brain injuries and also matched controls to either mimic an emotion that, in response to a word, or mimic it in response to a photo, or else just talk about a particular story about an event that happened to them. And in each of these cases, we videoed their faces, and we got raters to rate the amount of expression they showed in their faces. We also asked them to, rate their own emotional experience as a result of doing these particular tasks, like how angry that made them feel, or how sad or happy, and so on. Okay. And this study was conducted by Marie Dethier, who I've got photographed here. What we found with this study, we had judges who were blind to condition who rated the faces, and we also got them to rate their experience from 1 to 7. What we found was that the people with brain injury, and this is in the yellow columns, were showing less expressivity as rated by judges to both angry and sad faces, and sad stimuli, stories as well. And we also found that they rated themselves, they didn't feel as sad in particular when they were relating these stories. So they weren't expressing an emotion as much, and they weren't feeling it as much. So the question is, are these subdued subjective feelings related to their ability to recognise emotions? So in order to understand this, we used the scores on the emotion perception test that I just showed you earlier as the outcome variable, and we looked at regression. We used age and group as some predictors of that. We also looked at a summary score of cognition, neuropsychological impairment, and we looked at the extent to which they showed facial expressivity in their tasks, in those tasks, and also the extent to which they rated an emotional experience when doing these tasks. And what we found was that there were 3 emotions we looked at. So for happiness, we found that cognition was a predictor. Nothing else was except the extent to which they rated their own experience. When we looked at anger, we found a very similar pattern. It was mainly the extent to which they rated their own experience that predicted their ability to recognise emotions. And finally, if we looked at sadness, we found exactly the same pattern. So overall, this would suggest that people who have traumatic brain injury do have this sort of subdued, subjective appraisal of emotional experience, and that somehow that is related to their ability to recognise emotions. So it's an interesting kind of insight into the complexity of emotional recognition and the fact that it might not be just cognition that's driving that, but a number of other factors as well. So that's all I've got to say. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much to Ellie for our wonderful collaboration. And I just finished by mentioning some of my colleagues, and of course we can see Ellie is right up there. Thank you and goodbye.